Okay, so I'm just going to finish up the second half of the chapter 10 lecture for gender. Okay, so this idea that politics are for real men, not girly men. First, in the chapter, they talk about masculinity in presidential elections. So the idea that our notions and understandings of traditional gender values have waned a bit in the last couple decades, obviously. We have more women in elected office in general. But nowhere is this gender issue more apparent than in presidential politics, where women are very rare as candidates and, of course, have never been elected into executive office, unless you count the whole winning by 2 million votes thing. So going back, this has, obviously in recent years when we talk about gender and politics, we tend to focus on the differences in the way that male candidates and female candidates are treated, especially for executive office, which personally, at least I've done, because I've literally done research on that. But this is something that's not new, right? Gender has been a large part of American politics for a very long period of time, especially presidential politics. So to illustrate this, they give the example of the presidential election of 1840, which was very, very gendered in its own way. So basically, William Henry Harrison and Martin Van Buren are running against each other. And Martin Van Buren was attacked in very sexist terms by William Henry Harrison, who alluded to Martin Van Buren wearing cologne. Ooh, so feminine. Or that, that he wore a corset, right? While images of Harrison were, pictures of him with his sleeves rolled up in front of a log cabin, right? Like a brawny paper towel situation. So when he won, he bought into his own logic a lot. Actually, Harrison did win by using this gendered technique of, questioning Van Buren's credibility for the office because questioning his masculinity. And so when he won, he bought into his own logic so much that in DC during the inaugural address, he did not wear a top coat because he thought it would make him appear weak and unmanly. But as a result of not wearing that coat when it's crazy cold in January in DC, he developed pneumonia and died 32 days later. So he's one of the shortest serving presidents because of masculinity. So like I said before, masculinity can kill. So this is something, again, in the modern era, we do see a lot of this, and they talked about that because obviously these are the elections we remember, right? So when Clinton ran originally, in the early 90s, he was questioned. His manhood was questioned. And largely this was because on the first part of it was he didn't serve in the military, right? He had a college deferment, because he was in college and then law school during Vietnam. And then really it was largely his manhood was questioned because his wife was not a conventionally subservient wife, right? She wasn't just baking cookies and staying at home and taking care of their child, right? So it's very interesting, in retrospect, obviously, that a lot of people argued he was gay and that Hillary was like a show wife or something like that, right? That she was some sort of demonically masculinized hydra, that she was the one running everything and controlling him. Of course, until the Lewinsky and other affairs went public, which led to, that impeachment trial, which of course didn't go through, but they still did it anyway. Which, we got that great video, if you haven't seen it, of him, him trying to worm his way out of certain things. They call him Slick Willie, that he tried to say, well, that depends on what the definition of is, which is still just one of my favorite quotes of all time. But anyway, so they, of course, after that, characterized him as a chauvinistic, skirt chaser. But before that, they were claiming he was homosexual. So it's interesting how the narrative tends to be convenient to discrediting someone based on their masculinity, especially in presidential politics, right? Because we have this idea of, who's the leader? Who's the person that should be in charge? It falls back to our family understandings of the man of the house, the man making the ultimate decisions, having the courage and strength to make those decisions. Those things are associated with men, right? Anyway, in the Gore v. Bush thing, same deal. Both of these guys were born to pretty rich backgrounds. I mean, obviously, George W. being from a legacy family, that's kind of like a whole nother thing. Like when your dad's in the CIA and then is president, that kind of helps you become president. But anyway, so Gore tried to kind of butch up his demeanor, which didn't really work as much because he seemed much more like an adult, I guess, that hadn't really had a fun streak or a childhood or thing like that, versus George W. was very much like a Peter Pan, right? That kind of thing, like a guy who never quite grew up all the way, which really played a lot better with voters, which is just, that's its own problem, right? We're like, we want the inexperienced guy you want to get a drink with instead of the guy that's like, oh, he's kind of boring, but he has all his facts and figures together, right? So it kind of shows how personality is so much of what we look at when we look at presidential elections. And oftentimes when you talk about personality, this is viewed through the lens of gender. And then Kerry is a girly man. Oh, this whole thing's amazing. So when Bush was running against Kerry, he was maligned for his military service, which is super ironic because Bush himself got out of actual direct service because of his power and prestige, like because of his family connections. He was able to be on a reserve Air Force base instead of, and he would just kind of check in, check out. He didn't actually serve a lot of the time, versus Kerry actually went to war. But he had all of those swift boat Republican people that ran those attack ads against him saying like, well, was he really a veteran? Because when he came back from the war, he protested the war. And you're like, yeah, a lot of veterans that came back from the war protested the war. That was kind of a thing at the time. They were disillusioned. They were young people when they went in, and then they realized, there's something doesn't quite add up about this war. So anyway, the ironic part was that Arnold Schwarzenegger at the time called him a girly man. Which is hilarious because in a way it's like very meta, because the whole girly man concept comes from Hans and Franz, this SNL bit, which you should know, but you don't probably. You don't understand that Dana Carvey is one of the best, comedians of this generation. But anyway, so there's this kind of Hans and Franz thing where they would pretend to be Arnold Schwarzenegger and make fun of him. And he literally used the thing they used to make fun of him to make fun of John Kerry, which is its own weird, bizarre thing. But anyway, it just shows how, like, in recent years, even before you had these more contentious, battles between female candidates and male candidates, you still had a lot of masculinity charges and masculinity attacks going on before women were even in these races. So obviously there's this gendered political divide, right? There's very, how we think about red and blue states, right? A lot of this is being seen nowadays by researchers more in terms of male versus female issues. So there's certain issues that women or men, and again, this is not like because you're female, you're going to vote this way, or because you're male, this way. It's just you are much more likely, right, on that kind of scale. And a lot of that, again, has to do with gender norms, gender expectations, gendered values, right? So women are much more likely to be in favor of gun control versus men are more likely to be in favor of gun ownership without limits. Men are more likely to be in favor of aggressive military conquests versus women are more likely to be in favor of diplomacy. Men are more likely to be in favor of stopping environmental regulations versus women are more likely to be in favor of seeing how these environmental issues are something that we need to take seriously, especially when it comes to protecting the health and welfare of children, right? So it's interesting that, men are much more likely to think global warming is a hoax. And these kind of interesting divides when it comes to gender itself. Okay, so when we're talking about the election of 2008 and 2012, 2008 was obviously a game changer when you had a woman and an African American vying for the Democratic nomination. But the characterization during that time, especially of Hillary Clinton versus Sarah Palin, in their gender presentation was actually kind of two sides of the same coin in a way. So, actually, even Obama himself had attacks on him for his masculinity, right? They attacked his education and polished speaking abilities, calling him effeminate, right? Which, again, didn't quite land because of our racial stereotypes about black masculinity that kind of counter that, right? But in my own research, when I looked at people's characterizations of Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin, of course, I looked at their political party affiliation and also what media sources they use to get their political information. I found that, of course, depending on what partisan news source they were using, they had different opinions. But there's this interesting theory, called the beauty myth, right? Naomi Wolf developed this idea that basically we have this understanding of beauty in the culture, and that really affects how we understand and interpret women and their bodies, right? Or take them seriously or really don't take them seriously. And so what I found in my own research is that people felt that, Clinton was often characterized, really belittled for either looking old, what was considered old, overweight, not hyper feminine. And what's interesting in 2008 versus 2012, in 2008, when Hillary ran that first time, she was really presenting herself in a more masculinized fashion. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that she knew that within the realm of politics, if you don't appear credible, knowledgeable, those kind of things, that can be a way that women are discounted. So she really played up the idea that she had more experience than Barack Obama, those kind of things, right? That he was kind of, less knowledgeable about these things, because she really had to counter the sexist understandings that women are less credible, less, fit for these kind of things. So it's interesting that Sarah Palin, on the other hand, presented a very hyper feminine representation of being the mom, all of those kind of things, being very feminine. Yet she was bullied and considered a body, right? She was really maligned in very sexist, sexually objectifying ways, right? In the same way, she was dismissed very similarly, again, two sides of the same coin, where Hillary was dismissed. And it comes down to this essential part of the beauty myth where Naomi Wolf says that we basically think that there's a dichotomy where women can either be intelligent and ugly or beautiful and stupid. And so as that false dichotomy, we understand people through that lens, right? And that's a lot of the media rhetoric that was around these two candidates. They would look at Hillary and say, okay, well, she's experienced, she's knowledgeable, she's very well-spoken and well-presented, but isn't she a little too well-spoken and too well-presented? Isn't she a little too stuffy and unapproachable, right? Versus, and isn't she a little old? Or they report, I found reports on her cankles, like things like that. Versus with Palin, they really focused on the idea that, she was a beauty queen at some point, right? She was in the pageants. They focus on her physical appearance, her youth, those kind of things. And really, it was really easy to diminish her in that way, because of, focusing on those aspects so hyper, instead of really, talking more about policy differences and things of that nature. What was interesting too is, again, that idea that during the 2012 election, they had a lot harder time with this whole Mitt Romney situation, right? So having Mitt Romney run against Obama, Mitt Romney himself was characterized as soft and effeminate and weak in a lot of news media, right? So in a way, his masculinity came into play when he ran against Obama. The 2016 election. Living through it, you understand. There were definitely some gender stuff. The video I have here, I'm going to add in here, is really from a masculinity scholar that was talking about his perceptions or understandings as he was writing a book about this during the actual election. So as a result, the video is a little bit dated by our current standards now that we know what happened. But it's interesting that this is during the primary season. He was already talking about the constructions of masculinity, even just in those primaries, right? So I'm going to put that video in here. But in general, there was a lot of, research or sociological insights into the debates, right? The kind of structure of the debates. I'm not a puppet, you're the puppet kind of things. There was that last debate where a lot of the camera angles, because Trump was kind of ambling around, it kind of looked like he was creepily walking up behind her and things like that. So anyway, it's really interesting how a lot of these things were themselves gendered. Jesus, the part where he said, oh, I don't know why she's not back, but it's disgusting. Meaning she had to use the restroom during the debate, and they only get X amount of minutes to do it. But if you're female and you've ever been at a large convention center and you needed to use the restroom, then you probably understand it takes a hell of a long time, because women's lines for those things tend to be way longer, right? If we had a lot of urinals to walk up to, maybe things would be different, right? So yeah, that kind of became part of a focus as well. So anyway, I'm going to put this clip in here, just this scholar talking about the way that gender was kind of impacting perceptions of this election.
It's great to be joined again by Jackson Katz, anti-sexist activist, author, and expert on violence, media, and masculinity. He is author of the book Man Enough: Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity. Jackson, when we think about gender and the 2016 election, most people's minds go to Hillary Clinton. We've heard allegations from Donald Trump that she's, quote, playing the woman card. I want to talk about that with you, but really, gender and masculinity in this election go way beyond Hillary Clinton being a woman, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely, David. When I set out to write this book, I was focusing on how Hillary Clinton's candidacy in 2016 was going to bring to the forefront or expose the gendered nature of American presidential politics in a fairly unprecedented way. But I, like many other people, couldn't predict that Donald Trump would then get into the race and be taken seriously by a significant percentage of the Republican electorate, to the point where gender became the central issue of the 2016 campaign. But the gender wasn't women, if you will, as represented by Hillary Clinton, but men and masculinity as represented by Donald Trump's candidacy. So I think his candidacy is all about his white manhood and his performance of a certain kind of aggressive, pugilistic white manhood. And so the debate has now shifted, I think, about the gender politics of the campaign, not just to Hillary Clinton and being a woman, and what implications that has for presidential politics in this campaign, but also how Donald Trump's masculinity and his support from a huge number of downwardly mobile white men has sort of reordered the political landscape.
Talk about that specifically. In other words, in what ways are we seeing that? Can we see it through the lens of particular issues, statements, events on the Donald Trump side?
Well, I think we can see it on that huge gender gap that Donald Trump has, even among white voters. Obviously, his candidacy has caught a wave, if you will, of interest and passionate support, not exclusively among white men, but overwhelmingly his supporters are white men, and that to me is not a coincidental feature of his popularity. It's the central feature. And if you listen to Donald Trump's supporters, if you ask them why do they support him and why do they feel so passionately about him, they say over and over again things like, he's a man, he stands up for himself, he fights back, he punches hard, he doesn't take any shit, he's got balls, he's not politically correct. It's not about his policy positions, although this stance has implications for policy questions. It's about his persona, his attitude, something that he embodies. And part of my thesis in Man Enough is that this is not a new thing in American presidential politics, that people who are voting for the president, when they're voting every 4 years, they're not just voting for a set of policy prescriptions, they're voting for a persona and a person who will embody the national manhood in a certain sense, because the president in the United States occupies a very powerful symbolic role. In addition to being the chief executive of the country, he, and it's always been he, also sort of in a sense personifies or embodies or represents literally the American manhood. In a country that sees itself as a very masculine country, the United States of America, the person who embodies that role, who plays that role, who performs that role, has a very powerful sort of symbolic hold on the popular imagination.
Does this tie into the ideas and hypotheses that what is resonating amongst many Republican primary voters of Donald Trump is the underlying authoritarianism? And this has been proposed as an answer to the question of, well, hold on a second. Donald Trump is sort of the anti-evangelical Christian. Why are evangelical Christians overwhelmingly supporting Donald Trump? And what some have pointed to is this underlying authoritarianism of Trump's ideas and policies. Does this tie into your gender and masculinity analysis in any way?
Oh, yeah, totally ties in, because authoritarianism, as it's embodied around the world in political movements, is overwhelmingly represented by male-dominant political movements. So it's hard to even separate the notion of authoritarian political governance and gender, and specifically masculinity, and the reinforcement of a certain kind of in this case, white male, patriarchal power. I think one of the other key connecting points between the evangelical right and Donald Trump, although on a certain level in terms of his personal resume, you would think that they would be horrified by him, he represents the defiant reassertion of the centrality of white male authority, which is a very big part of evangelical ideology, which is the analysis of a lot of right-wing evangelicals is one of the reasons for the decline of the country, as they see it, is that men have lost control to women. Heterosexuals have lost control of the agenda about sexual orientation to the gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender movements, and parents have lost control over their kids. In other words, the way to reinscribe and go back to the way that things should be is to reinforce white male patriarchal power in the family and in the political system. And so they can overlook some of the cruder aspects of Donald Trump's serial adultery and mistreatment of women and sexual objectification of women, because in a larger sense, he embodies the white male leadership that they aspire to.
Let's talk a little bit about the Democratic primary as we've seen it. You know, earlier in the primary battle between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, we started seeing the early stages of attempts to cast Bernie Sanders as the guy who shouts down women and trying to introduce or cast Bernie Sanders in some way as sexist. My argument is that it did not really catch on. But talk a little bit about your observations regarding the gender dynamics within the Democratic primary a little bit.
Sure. Now, that's a very, I think, interesting development that's happened in the Bernie Sanders campaign. I think what Bernie Sanders embodies, in a certain sense, is a kind of street fighting, white, Jewish and ethnic Brooklyn kind of masculinity that has been missing from Democratic Party discourse for the past 40 plus years, as the Democrats have put up a candidate after candidate who is kind of cautiously centrist and corporatist, and in their personal style is very cerebral but not very pugilistic in their affect. If you look at the last several Democratic nominees, they've been very smart and talented individuals, but they haven't been at all channeling a kind of anger and aggressive kind of defiance of the rule of the billionaires or the 1%. Bernie Sanders does that. Bernie Sanders, even though he doesn't look particularly impressive in the more traditional sense of what a president is supposed to look like. And again, that's all coded with assumptions, and I appreciate that. But he does have this the persona that he fights back, and he'll take on the hard power source, the sources of power in the 1% and make the billionaires pay their fair share. And I think that a lot of voters on the Democratic side, including a significant gender gap that he still has, Bernie Sanders, in terms of his support for more men than women, people can relate to that and resonate with that. It's very complicated, however, because he's running against a woman who is, if she's elected, going to be the first woman president of the United States, which is a phenomenally important, symbolically important, as well as in other ways important development. So irrespective of the political differences between them, him being to her left, her being much more of a centrist, moderately liberal candidate, irrespective of those differences, the gender politics are very interesting, because you could argue that Bernie Sanders has a platform, if you will, that will help women in many fundamental ways on a class level, but he hasn't been able to articulate, I think, very effectively how his analysis is broader than just a class analysis, and incorporate the centrality of the gender issues in a way that Hillary Clinton can. And even though she's not as progressive as he is on economic issues, she's the one who's constantly bringing up abortion rights and reproductive rights and pay equity issues, to the point where progressive voters who are keyed into the importance of those issues have a significant conflict.
In thinking about potential national debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, can you give us a sort of preview of the ways in which the sort of reality that Hillary Clinton is a woman and Donald Trump is a man could play out in the forefront of viewers' minds? In other words, in what ways could gender sort of take a backseat during those hypothetical potential debates that we see? And in what ways could gender come to the forefront of viewers' minds?
Well, I mean, I think if it's going to be Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, I think the whole election is about gender. I think it's inescapable, and it's going to come up in so many different ways, both overtly and subtextually. It's actually fascinating if we can remove ourselves from the political implications of what would happen if Donald Trump is elected president, which I think would be a disaster for democracy, and just taking it one step removed and thinking about it in terms of just as a case study in a sort of national referendum about the state of women's advancement versus the state of the backlash against women's advancement, it's like right out of central casting, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, because Donald Trump, in addition to his other political views, and again, his racism and his bigotry is obviously an important part of his appeal to a certain sector of the white Republican electorate. He's also, the way that he talks about women, the crude way that he talks about women, the highly sexually objectifying way that he treats women and has talked about them for decades and decades. If he was elected president, in spite of all that, what a statement that would make about where we are as a society, about how important it is, how gender equality is important, because we would be saying that if he was elected, that a majority of the voting electorate of the United States of America in 2016 has elected a person, a man, who is transparently misogynist. And it would be such a statement about how far we have to go. On the flip side, Hillary Clinton, as a woman, has to present herself not just as a woman running for president, but as somebody who's capable of leading the country, if you will. And so on foreign policy issues, where she's been criticized very strongly from her left as being hawkish, a lot of that hawkishness plays in her favor because it undermines the idea that a woman has to prove her manhood. Well, actually, it doesn't undermine that. It reinforces it. It undermines the idea that a woman is not strong, quote unquote, strong enough to be the commander in chief, because if she's being criticized from the left for being too hawkish, that actually plays to her advantage among more moderate and centrist voters who like that aspect of her persona. So gender is all over the place in this conversation. David, one thing I want to make sure that I mention is a big part of my book, Man Enough, is about how the Republican Party has successfully, I have to say, manipulated white lower middle class and working class men for decades now into voting against their economic interests. And my argument is that it's not just about coded racial appeals or so-called wedge issues. It's about the subtext of both race and gender. And I think that the Republican nominees over the last 35, 40 years have won a huge percentage of white male votes. And Barack Obama cut into that in 2008. He cut into the white male advantage that Republicans have had, and he was elected in a significant victory in 2008 and then reelected in 2012 with very little white male support. And remember, Barack Obama lost by 25 to 27% among white male voters. The Republicans know that in order to win a national election, they have to win an overwhelming majority of white male votes. So they have to nominate candidates who can keep up that percentage of difference, because they know they're going to lose the women's vote. They know they're going to lose the people of color vote.
Right.
They have to win an overwhelming majority of white male voters. So you'll see in this coming campaign cycle all kinds of ways in which Donald Trump will be attempting to present himself. He's already been doing it, obviously, as the candidate that a quote unquote real man should support, especially a real white man. The question is, can Hillary Clinton cut into Donald Trump's support among white male voters? Because if she can, and she's doing very badly on that score in the polls right now, if she can cut into his majority among white male voters, she'll win in a landslide.
Right.
So much of the campaign is going to be about this gender and racialized gender split.
All right. The book is Man Enough, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity. We've been speaking with the book's author, Jackson Katz. Jackson, always great to speak to you.
Likewise, David. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there are a lot of ways that various gender issues play out in the political arena. Meaning, how are these issues like sexuality, a balance between work and family, women's reproductive rights, like how do these things become political, right? It's because governments care about gender, right? Gender is a part of every social institution. You know, the family, work and the economy, education, religion, right? All of these things. They're very much a part of our institutions and the way that we understand people and their roles and responsibilities in these institutions. So obviously governments really do care about this. Like fertility, for example, the number of children that are born affects institutions. So you could think about how the number of kids you have is going to affect the educational institution, right? The baby boomers, for example, there was a lot of them, so they had to change the structure of education. And really, even my generation, there's a whole bunch of us too. And so as a result, they kind of had to expand the school system as I was growing up to accommodate that. Social Security, right? Right now, 10,000 baby boomers are retiring each day right now. So how is that going to affect the structure of Social Security, right? Again, we don't talk about this in terms of money or politics. We typically talk about fertility or issues like that as a matter of religion or morality. But really, it does have a lot to do with politics, right? Sandra Fluck, she basically, there was this hearing in Congress about women's reproductive rights. And it was talked about largely because this picture down here at the bottom that Nancy Pelosi tweeted out showed that the panel that was making the decisions on women's healthcare access had no women on the panel, right? They're deciding whether private institutions had to offer reproductive options in their medical coverage for women, right? Because during the Obamacare stuff, they finally acknowledged that women's services are actually preventative medicine, right? Like if you provide certain services are covered under those kind of, financial understanding. So as a result, birth control became one of those things. But there were a lot of private institutions, like especially religious institutions, that said that they didn't want to give that to their employees, right? They wanted their employees to have to pay out of pocket for those things. So Sandra Fluke was a student at Georgetown, and she decided to testify on behalf of, women that were in those situations where they wanted to have access but didn't have it. And, she was a law student at the time. Initially, she was excluded from testifying. But then, of course, people kind of stirred up a whole thing about it, so she was able to. But, of course, this drew the ire of every conservative media outlet, right? Especially Rush Limbaugh, who called her a slut and suggested that if she wanted the government to provide birth control for her, then she should have to record sex and put it up for him and others to see, right? Because if their tax dollars are paying for it, which again, that's not how tax dollars work at all. I could really get into that someday if you're interested. That's not at all how taxes work. But that is the rhetoric that people believe, and what people believe tends to be what reality is versus actual reality. So it's just an interesting historical time note, how she had to go and testify and, kind of try to draw attention to the issues that women face. And part of what she was talking about was how some women are using this not for specifically unprotected sex. They're using it to regulate their cycles. Oftentimes, there's some certain medical conditions or dysmenorrhea or things like that that some women face that really birth control kind of stabilizes those hormones for them, or often just makes your cycle much more irregular. Right? Like I had a friend that after she started taking birth control, it would be like the second Tuesday of the month at 5 p.m., right? Like she was so regular in that kind of way. So, and again, it's legal. Women shouldn't have to be embarrassed that if they are actually using birth control to prevent pregnancy, that's their right. And if people have a problem with that, I would refer them to the show Call the Midwife, where you can see what the kind of situations were before women had those kind of opportunities and choices, or even in Half the Sky that we watched, of, the kind of conditions that women face when they have to face, 10 or more pregnancies in a lifetime. How is that going to affect their family, how their finances, their careers, their everything, right? How much of an education can you get when you have that many children? So these things matter to a lot of people. But again, the government really sets up the standard for what is allowed, what kind of contraceptive access we do have. And those things really affect people's individual lives. So we know men and women do have biological, hormonal, and other minor differences, right? But of course, we often overlook how similar we are. We tend to focus on the things that are different more than anything. But when it comes down to the politics of gender, a lot of this has to do with gender discrimination. And that often comes from that belief in the biological differences that lead to gender differences, right? Like the stuff we talked about in the very beginning of the class, right? People that assume that men are more aggressive than women, meaning, well, if men are just naturally aggressive, then that means women by default are not, and therefore they shouldn't be in the military. When we know in reality, people, male, female, non-binary, whatever you are, some people are aggressive, some people aren't, right? It's not necessarily a gendered issue. So, again, and the idea that, if you're born male, you're aggressive, you're a good fit for the military, it's just not true. right? I'm sure even if you have served yourself in the military, you know there's people in your life that you're like, nah, they wouldn't be suited for the military. And it's not just because they're male or female, it's because of their own personalities, right? So, the military needs aggressive people. They need people that are strong and capable and rush into action. And that doesn't necessarily mean men. It just means that when that's associated with a gender role and people inhabit the role, it just means that more men end up in those positions, right? So it's very often difficult to show that this discrimination has taken place because it's not as overt. We tend to self-select our gender discrimination, like what major you have in school or even what classes you take, and those things tend to be motivated by these kind of very subtle, unconscious things. So, and when it comes to sex discrimination, when you look at the representation of the LGBTQ community and the fact that until recently, same-sex marriage was illegal, you can see how this is clearly a case of sex discrimination, because if a woman can marry a man, why can a woman not marry a woman, right? And of course, these things have been dealt with, but with current political understandings and the backlashes that tend to happen whenever rights are won, these things are still tentative, and there's a lot of states that try and restrict some of these rights, right? And again, we're talking about people's ability to live their lives, get married, have kids, live their American dream, which should be kind of separate from politics. People think like, politics, why vote? That doesn't affect my life. It's like, well, actually it affects very personal things in our daily lives, but we often don't see the way that structure affects these things, these opportunities. So when it comes to gender-based discrimination, transgender people face a lot of gender-based discrimination. And part of this has to do with the fact that there's not enough protection for these marginalized people. They're very marginalized group, right? They're not even, even until recently, weren't even completely accepted within the LGBTQ community, let alone in the larger kind of cisgendered, misunderstood, very heteronormative community. People would often conflate gender identity with sexuality, meaning like if a trans woman was dating a man, they would say, oh, you're homosexual. And it's like, no, it's a woman and a man, that's heterosexual, right? But the idea, the social role of being a woman versus being born a man and then transitioning to a woman, people still associate that woman with the the sexual identity of birth, right? Meaning you were born biologically male, therefore you're male and you've become female. Instead of realizing, well, socially you're female. That's how you live. That's how you understand yourself. That's kind of how we should respect people, right? I feel like if my understanding of someone's gender is not going to be as clear as their personal understanding of their own gender, right? Who the hell am I to tell someone like, no, you're not female, right? I don't know, right? It's a very personal, internalized thing. So the big problem with this is that this is a kind of a more recent issue and just knowledge and understanding. And the more visible the community becomes, the more protections hopefully we'll see. But, even with the visibility of high profile stars like Caitlyn Jenner and people like that, Laverne Cox, it's still very difficult to, really take seriously the issues that are facing the trans community, especially trans women of color who are being killed in this country at epidemic levels. Especially for how small of a population this is, the amount of women being killed is just horrifying. Anyway, so people transitioning from one gender to another are subject to our ideas that people are only one or the other, right? They're subject to the dichotomy. So these issues pop up like, what bathroom do you use? How do you get a passport? How do you get a driver's license? How do you, let's say you transitioned and you want to get a job. How do you get your transcripts, right? Things like that, because they're going to have the name from previously. So these things are, a huge hassle and barrier that are put up for the trans community. In the book, they talked about the 2011 National Transgender Discrimination Survey that found that 1 in 5 trans people faced housing discrimination. More than 1 in 10 had been evicted because of their identity. And again, there aren't legal protections nationally for this group of people, meaning you could literally be kicked out of your house because you're trans, right? Your apartment doesn't have to give you your deposit back, and you're screwed on finding another place to live. Like, we can find parallels to this, right? I mean, obviously people of color still face housing discrimination, though not quite as regularly as a, that often being evicted because of race and these kind of things. At school, trans people face a lot of discrimination and harassment. When it came to the survey, 9 out of 10 transgender students reported that they did not feel safe at school. And we understand how important it is to feel safe at school so that you can achieve, better grades to get you to a better place, to get you, that degree, that money, that security. So these, again, those 9 out of 10 transgender students faced a high prevalence of harassment, often faced physical assault and sexual violence, which meant that they would often just leave or transfer schools instead of the schools taking these things more seriously. Because again, the protections aren't there as much when it comes to legally. So some people argue that this harassment of trans people, right, that the things that they have to face, the microaggressions and the just, stigma and harassment is normal, right? They basically, it's a very victim blaming kind of thing. They blame the unconventional gender performance and say, well, that might make people uncomfortable because our whole society is organized around the idea of the gender dichotomy is normal. So when you see something that goes against your dichotomous understandings, you want to fit someone into a box. Are you this? Are you that? But when we realize there aren't 2 boxes, there's many boxes, and that maybe we shouldn't have boxes at all and just kind of spectrums and let people, I don't know, be who they are. Those things can make people real uncomfortable because they don't understand it. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means that they're ignorant, so they react very negatively. And this is a huge problem because the discomfort thing used to literally be a protection that was used for murdering trans people, right? This idea that, I didn't know that this woman I was dating, was born biologically male, and therefore once I found out, I freaked out and killed her, right? And you're like, well, that has a lot more to do with heterosexism and fear of masculinity, that idea of, being hypermasculine. A lot of men fear being labeled or seen as homosexual because of the kind of stigma and problems that come with that. And so a lot of people conflate sexuality issues with trans issues. When you're talking about gender versus sexuality, these are 2 completely different things. Your internal understanding of who you are gender-wise is very different from your understanding of who you want to have sex with, right? So one of the cases they use as a precedent, because anytime there's court cases about these things, you need precedents, would be the Pan Am versus Diaz case. So this is a case where a man sued, the Pan Am airline, which no longer exists as far as I know, because he wanted to be a flight attendant, but he was told that that was impossible. At the time, women were the only allowed to be flight attendants, and he was told that a male flight attendant would make people uncomfortable. So that's kind of where this discomfort precedent comes from. So of course, again, trans people still have no federal protections in the world of work, meaning if you transition at your job, you could then lose your job and not be able to do anything about that. And that's really upsetting. And of course, the bathroom bills, right? Oh, Jesus. They're spreading everywhere. So these bathroom bills, the bathrooms themselves do not require anatomical parts, right? It's a space for the social understanding of men and women, which is gender, not sexuality, but gender, not even sex, but gender. So meaning that people should not need to prove their parts to go into a room as much as their dress and their social role of being a man or a woman is what really determines who should use what bathroom. And, we have a parallel to a recent history of discriminating and segregating bathrooms. And I feel like most of us look back at the Jim Crow era and say, wow, that was really wrong and racist and horrible. Yet we're willing to do the same thing now, right? To kind of put in legal discrimination into the law to force certain groups of people to put themselves at risk, right? And what is the justification for the bathroom bills? This fear, this completely unbridled fear that has no logic in reality, that somehow trans women using women's bathrooms are going to assault or hurt women or girls, which again, there's no precedent cases for. Versus, what there's a lot of precedents for? Men just walking into women's bathrooms and assaulting them. There's nothing to stop a man, because this idea if you let people use the bathroom of their preferred gender identity, then men will just put on a dress and walk into a woman's bathroom, right? Turns out you don't have to do that. There's nothing stopping a man from walking into a women's bathroom. Women get assaulted, raped, and killed in bathrooms all the time. So this idea that trans women are the problem is just ridiculous. Also, guess who faces a lot of violence and problems when they're forced to use a male bathroom? Trans women. So really, you're just putting a very marginalized group of people at risk and in fear and really making them feel like public spaces aren't for them and that, it's only for cisgendered people that are considered quote unquote normal in our culture. So the state itself is a gendered institution. So we have these issues of gender that we see in politics, but also politics itself is gendered. So not only are the issues that we argue about in politics, birth control, the number of kids you have, work policies, like, the fact that we don't have, paid family leave and things of that nature. Those are issues of gender that are argued in politics, but the environment and the political world itself is also highly gendered, right? As we talked about before, the part of your career that's supposed to be set up for future success is often during the childbearing years. So typically in one's later 20s and early 30s, they have to dedicate themselves to their career and put in a lot of hours in order to get to prestigious competitive positions, especially in professions like lawyers, professors, those kind of things where you have to work a lot of hours and things. So that can often set you up for later political office, right? A lot of lawyers go into politics, which is probably why we're not huge fans of Congress, because think about it. Who likes lawyers? Not many people. And then Congress is just full of them. It's not surprising that they're kind of awful and just talk nonsense. So, legalese is what they call it. So this is, that's kind of the way that a lot of people get to those higher offices. They set themselves up with certain career fields or certain prestige and then make their way to those ladders of success. But for women who want to have children, they have to do so during these same years. So they largely have to choose between their career or children. And there are a lot of professional women who, become those lawyers, get to those city council positions, become mayor, like move up that chain to local office to more national representative office. But then they basically achieve these career heights to later realize that they didn't stop and have children. And though in vitro and things of that nature are changing, it really becomes this dilemma, much more so for women than men, where they have to kind of choose one or the other instead of, being able to have both, like most people in other countries do. If you have paid family leave, those things kind of go away a little bit. So gender is an identity, right? It's something inside of us that's a facet of our personal identity, but it's also a set of processes that are deeply embedded in the institutions themselves and really the institutional logics of our society. So as a result, citizens in our culture are assumed male, right? Not just because the founding fathers said all men are created equal, right? Instead of all people are created equal. But in our minds, we see citizens as white, rich, and primarily as men. And that's just the default setting of what we consider normal. So that affects the kind of way, it's something real kind of boring, but if you've taken stats, then you know that when you're comparing certain variables, you typically set one as the baseline standard of normal, and then you set the other one to be compared against it. That's kind of the way we understand gender, right? We see women as having a gender more so than men. Men are just normal, and women are just like a weird version of men, right? Plucked a rib out of a man and made a woman kind of thing, right? So globalization is really affecting this. Globalization itself is also gendered, right? The economic integration have different impacts around the world on women and men. So obviously we know there's unequal wages, and this also applies to around the world. There's unequal labor force participation and unequal control over one's body, something we saw a little bit in Half the Sky. So the definition of femininity and masculinity is shifting, and this has a lot to do with globalization. With the spread of jobs and industries worldwide, there's a spread of the dominant global masculinity, which privileges white English-speaking men as what a businessman looks like, right? What a boss looks like. When you think of a CEO, close your eyes and think of a CEO, it's typically you're picturing like an old stuffy white dude. So, resistance to globalization itself is also gendered. Like the global movements and things of that nature are often run by women or, groups of people that are very marginalized that are often being exploited through these new systems, right? Because, again, it has to do with your value and the culture has to do with how much you're paid. And the less you're valued, the more your labor is exploited in these kind of ways. And again, this goes all back to colonization, right? Colonial powers nearly always use gender. They would say that the men that were colonized had inadequate masculinity, and the women that were colonized had helpless innocence. It kind of goes back to that understanding of what we call Orientalism. This understanding that when the British went into the Orient and colonized it, when they conquered the men, they considered them effeminate. And that affected even today, our understandings of the sexuality of Asian men versus Asian women were kind of turned into this hypersexualized, helpless innocence. The white man is the savior and all of these kind of things, because of that same colonial logic. These things run real deep, right? And they kind of embed themselves in our cultural understandings. So racism itself is sexed and gendered. So through different colonial struggles, white men projected their fears and anxieties onto different men of color. So, like, for example, black men, especially after, emancipation, you have this anxiety and fear that were put on black men that argued that black men were untamed. They had these sexual desires that result in uncontrollable lust. So controlling black male sexuality became the responsibility of white men to protect their white women. Though, let's be real, during that same time period, especially during slavery itself, while they were hyping up these fears of black men's sexuality, who was having sex with black women? Largely these white male slave owners, right? And so it's interesting that when we talk about the directionality of that, it kind of fits right in line with other understandings of colonization, right? The helpless innocence of the women that are, just basically considered property to be taken versus the men themselves are considered to be feared and need to be controlled, right? So lynching, for example, especially in the Reconstruction era, like just the time period after emancipation, lynchings themselves often included genital mutilation of black men, as obviously a nod to this fear that they were affecting, white women. Or like, the Emmett Till situation, where he was just beaten to a pulp. And the rumor was that he whistled at a white woman, which again, this woman actually very recently, very elderly woman now, recanted and said, no, he didn't actually whistle at her at all. But very famous case. His mother was pretty brave to have him presented with an open casket so people could see what happened to him. So, as political movements have formed around the world, they often have a gendered nature to them as well. So women were very active in the Arab Spring. They were active in the Occupy movement and other recent movements such as Black Lives Matter. Literally Black Lives Matter was started by 3 women, something you don't hear about a lot. They actually attribute it to a lot of men, which is really interesting to me. But anyway, rights movements are trying to expand the role of women in society. And there's also these conservative or fundamentalist movements going on at the same time, like the Tea Party or, these kind of Trumpers that want to restore society to the traditional foundations. They seek to transform gender relations, but in the opposite direction, meaning put women back in the kitchen, barefoot and pregnant, and, men should be in the power positions, and, immigrants and minorities should not have the kind of, rights and opportunities that they have. So, it's interesting that we have these gendered issues motivating different issues in the political spectrum, right? The idea of protecting, getting rid of abortion, right? That's a very political understanding, though it's a very personal thing whether you have a child or not. That's a very personal thing that it feels, at least to me, again, this is my own editorializing, but it feels pretty bizarre. Like, I don't feel like I should have the right to tell anyone if they have a kid or not, right? To be like, no, you have to have that child. Well, then if you don't want a kid, then just don't ever have sex, right? These kind of things are really ridiculous in an era that we've had birth control pills since the 1960s. We've forgotten why we needed birth control. And again, when you look at other countries around the world, you see that don't have access to these things, you see why we need it. You see the role of women that has transformed in the work world and education and otherwise, and just the family security and stability that's changed, right? Having 2 or 3 kids and having the financial wherewithal to do that versus 10, 11, 12, up to 20 children. Unless you're like the Dugars and you do that to like whore out your family for fame. But anyway, the majority of us don't do that. And it's really interesting how these things tend to be, we think of them as, again, just, abstract values, but they really have to do with our understandings of gender. And really, we want to regulate what is considered appropriate gender, while other people want to enhance that or liberate that from the kind of social understandings. So, there's this thing you hear a lot when it comes to these issues of gender and politics, is what they call the personal is political. So this just means that the daily routines of our lives, such as housework, right? Who should clean the house? Who does the dishes? Who, whatever. Maybe raising your children, right? Who's the disciplinarian? Who's the one that spoils them? Who's the giving them affection and attention? Even the, negotiating activities with your significant others, right? Who makes the financial decisions? Even like with your friends, how you act, what you watch on TV, what music you listen to, how you have sex, right? All of these things are actually, they're all parts of our everyday life that's reflected by the gender difference and gender inequality in society. So those things are all being, argued about, debated about within the political realm. And again, it seems very personal, right? Like what kind of, dynamic my boyfriend and I decide of who's making dinner, who's cleaning, who's, doing those kind of things. Seems like a personal choice, but really these things are being litigated on a national scale. So, since its inception, the women's rights movement has really sought to bring about an equal status between men and women in society. And so the first wave itself was largely associated with suffrage, right? Trying to get women the right to vote. But it was also trying to move women into the public sphere in other ways, right? It's really interesting that a lot of these women of the first wave were also abolitionists, meaning they were fighting the cause of ending slavery. And so it's interesting that they were kind of rallying for this marginalized group, and then after a while they realized, hey, we're also being screwed. Maybe we should get together and fight for our own rights. So the first wave is typically thought of as happening from like the 1880s, or even sometimes from the 1860s on, to about 1920. And it supposedly ends, the first wave, once women got the right to vote in 1920. The second wave is thought of in about the 1960s through the 70s. And this really focused on a lot of issues related to gender inequality. It's very difficult to be like, second wave was about this, because it was really about fighting for equality, but in so many ways, in the world of work, in education, in politics, in sports, dealing with sexual issues, meaning having access to contraceptives and abortion, having control over your own reproduction and sexuality. I mean, women didn't even have bank accounts at that time, right? You had to, well, if you wanted a credit card, you had to get permission from your husband, right? So women didn't really have large control over, let alone the reproductive capabilities and sexuality. Also, the second wave dealt with issues of violence against women, meaning terms like domestic violence, sexual assault, those things didn't exist before the second wave. And, sexual harassment, rape, those issues, they really brought those things to term so that people had to face the, these are problems that are happening. Like sexual harassment wasn't considered a thing before that point. It was just considered what women face at work. It was just normal. And it wasn't until second wave said, like, women are people, they should be treated with respect. No one should go to work and fear their boss or fear having to deal with harassment just in order to get a paycheck. Right? So there's a lot of issues going on there in the second wave. But it's kind of, what we think of as the women's rights movement, that kind of time period. And then the third wave is really from the 1980s onward, which has really embraced a much more intersectional, inclusive, multicultural approach to feminist issues. So this means not just looking at what often nowadays people call white feminism, which, yes, the second wave did focus a lot more on wealthier or, middle-class white women, just as the first wave really focused on wealthy, affluent white women. And even some of the first wave, proponents of the right to vote even said, well, maybe we'll just let white women get the right to vote. And just like black women, not so much. So there was still a lot of racism and issues in those things. But if you think about how activism works, it kind of makes sense, especially in those early eras, like the first wave of the movement. Who had the time and money and ability to be an activist? It's not the woman that has 15 kids that's a seamstress that's doing piecemeal work at home on her off time, right? It's the wealthy woman that has the kind of high society opportunity. So in the same kind of way, the second wave was much more like a very student-led, a very young-led movement, like during the same time as like the anti-war and sexual revolution movements. So it was kind of focused on a more collegiate, middle-class, white focus, more issues for housewives and things like that. So again, third wave changed this. Third wave was looking much more at, multicultural and intersectional inclusive issues like looking at issues of poor women, issues that women of color face, issues for indigenous women or immigrant women or women working in the third world, right? Trans women, lesbians, disabled women, women of all religious creeds and national backgrounds, and men, right? Actually understanding that the system of gender itself doesn't just hurt women. It does privilege men in some ways, but it also, that privilege comes with a price, right? Like you might have control or patriarchal dominance over your household, but you're also expected to be the physical protector. Like you hear that noise in the night, who's expected to get up and deal with it, right? So those things are, for men, it can be very constraining to not be allowed to cry, to not be allowed to express yourself in any sort of way, to really have to conduct yourself in a very measured way. So, third wave is really much more the kind of modern understanding of inclusivity and intersectionality that we talk about a lot. All right, so feminism. So people tend to think like, if you're a feminist, you're a feminist, you all agree. There's like so many different kinds of feminists. And the ones they talk about in the book are just kind of like the basic. You got your Marxists, you got all sorts of different feminists. So we'll talk about a couple of them here. But feminism is really the hint for your essay question. Feminism is what links first wave, second wave, and third wave of the women's rights movement. Because feminism is the ideology that, the belief in the social and political and economic equality of everyone, or, at least in the duality men and women. So liberal feminism is kind of like that second wave feminism, right? They want to change. Liberal doesn't mean what people think it does, I guess. Liberal just means you want to change the system from within. So you make women have more rights by voting or by changing the laws. So if you look during the second wave, you have like Title IX reforms or things of that nature that, literally change the structures of the laws. Like they tried to pass the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was never ratified. Anyway, so yeah, they're more about, you change the system by getting more women elected into office, changing the legal structures to be more inclusive. Radical feminists, not so much. They're more about fighting against the patriarchy, whether that's in media representations or the sex trade or all of these kind of patriarchal notions of women's bodies and understandings of women. They believe that you can't just change the institution to now include women. You gotta just destroy and rebuild that entire social institution. Because remember, the institutions are built with gender inequality within them, just as they're built with sexism and racism and homophobia and these other things that are just a product of the time period in which they're built. So radical feminists say, no, it's not enough to just say, okay, now women have Title IX protections, but you have to actually change the institutions to make them completely inclusive. And then multicultural feminism is really just beginning where the other two are leaving off, meaning that, adding to liberal and radical feminism that inclusiveness of the third wave. So they see the movement as a global movement and not just as something in the kind of white Western world. So when it comes to men and gender politics, feminism does not mean men are not included, right? The whole idea of why it's called of feminism. And remember, this kind of goes back to the gender hierarchy of society, right? Why is it that we'll say, hey, you guys, when we're talking about a room full of guys and girls, but we wouldn't refer to them as girls? Hey, you girls. Why? Because men are offended by being called girls. Like, girls can be called guys, but guys can't be called girls because they're going down the hierarchy, right? You go from being a man to being a woman, and that's going down in status. It's considered offensive, like when guys will say, or like a coach will call his team girls. It's supposed to be offensive. So obviously in the language, we can kind of see how, those understandings work. And so there's this interesting dichotomy between anti-feminist men and pro-feminist men, meaning that some men see women's rights as an attack on men. So this goes back to that idea of like, why is it called feminism? People say, well, I'm a secular humanist. I believe in equality, but I don't want to use the word feminism because it's so anti-men. It's not. Feminism is just, using fem just acknowledges that there's been a large power dynamic of inequality between men and women throughout generations, right? That's really all it means, is that you're starting with the baseline assumption that, like, yeah, stuff has been unequal, right? To be a secular humanist is to pretend that everything's equal and we just want to maintain equality, versus it's not equal. It's still not equal. It's not equal for men and women, right? There's things that women can do that men can't do. There's things that men can do that women can't do. And a lot of this is just not, it's not good all the way around. So a lot of these meninist dudes, they don't understand feminism. They think that feminism only cares about women, and they think that that women are trying to lift themselves above men to put men down. Unless we're gonna I don't know, completely segregate men from society, take away their jobs, take away their opportunities. Like if you've read The Handmaid's Tale, unless we did the opposite of that to men, right? Flip that gender role around. There's no way that would actually happen, right? It's kind of ridiculous. It's like when people say reverse racism because they were discriminated against. Discrimination is not the same as racism. Racism is a system of power that is set up one group as dominant over hundreds of years, versus same thing with this whole kind of understanding of feminism. To say that women have definitely not had the same rights as men, on purpose for a long period of time, especially in the Western world. And now in the third wave, this understanding of masculinities, meaning literally the guy who wrote your textbook is a masculinity scholar. We're in a gender course and it's a dude writing the book. He is a pro-feminist male that understands that when you look at gender as a problem, it's a problem for men and women. It's not just a women's issue. But when it's considered a women's issue, it's considered frivolous and not given the same kind of attention. Something we'll talk about when we talk about violence, how, issues of violence against women become an issue. Instead of seeing it as male violence, we see it as women as victims, so it's not really that important. So anyway, these meninists think that women want to take away their rights, or they'll often say stuff like, oh, well, what, you think women are portrayed bad in the media? Well, so are men. Men are now hypersexualized. And it's yeah, obviously. And that's not what feminists want. It's not like they're okay, well, let's make sure men's rights are taken away so that they're lowered to the status of women. They want to be able to lift up their own rights to the status of what men have, right? And again, equality is not oppression. And I feel like I always have to repeat that. Equality is not oppression. Having the same rights as someone does not mean you are being oppressed, right? But that's often the way the dominant groups see it, because they feel like something's being taken away. What's being taken away? The privilege that they literally say they don't have. So it's an interesting dynamic. Anyway, pro-feminist men, there's a lot of men that support gender equality, and they're not threatened by women's advancement. They see them as allies, as friends, as loved ones, as mothers, as sisters, etc. They see women as human beings. They respect that they should have the same rights, right? There's a lot of male advocacy groups that work to stop male violence against women, which, again, we're going to watch a video about that later. It's like Jackson Katz and other people that really want to help men deal with the toxic cultural messages about masculinity that paint them as murderers and rapists that are unable to control their impulses that we talked about in the beginning, and how this really sets men up for failure when you're supposed to be this hyper-masculine John Wayne archetype, but that's all a construction. And so when men feel that they don't measure up to it, it can be a real status blow, right? We don't have a way for men to feel secure in their masculinity. They have to keep proving it. And as a result, this can lead to a lot of issues of anxiety, suicide, violence. And it's really sad that men are killing themselves in such high rates in this country, largely because of societal understandings of what a man should be that they feel like they're not measuring up to, instead of understanding that we could just change the societal notion instead of making people feel like they don't fit so that they need to end their lives. So, pro-feminist men understand the relationships between these things. They understand that women are allies, that they do care about the negative things that men face. And when men have a better understanding about women's issues, that's when they realize that things like birth control or family planning or family leave even really positively affect them, right? Men that have a spouse that's working, they tend to report higher levels of satisfaction, not just because the wife has more self-esteem and value for her own self-worth because she's working, but also because then he's not completely the only breadwinner having to stressfully somehow provide for his entire family, which in this economy is just not really possible in the same way it used to be, right? So in a lot of ways, men, when they realize that, feminism is not the scary word, that feminism doesn't make them less of a man, that, being a feminist, that those kind of things tend to go away. There was that study that came out that said that men didn't understand, or they said that they didn't think birth control positively affected them, which is crazy laughable, because I don't know how many of those dudes are no, I wanted to be so-and-so's baby's father, right? Because that's what happens when women aren't taking birth control. You could be legally on the hook to pay money for 18 years to take care of a kid because you had a sexual encounter with somebody frivolously. So it's really interesting that men don't see it, because again, that's not part of the rhetoric of what we hear. Men are normal, women are kind of like the abnormal version of men, and we don't get to really hear about how, these things really positively affect families, that the happiness levels, the marital stability and those kind of things, can often benefit from a more inclusive understanding of each other. But there is this kind of characterization of feminism, and it's not by accident. It's not like the Meninists came out of nowhere. There was a huge financially motivated public media campaign in the early 80s to smear feminism, because they gained a lot of rights. Think about it. In about 15-year period of time, they radically transformed the role of women in society. And people got freaked out, right? Especially conservatives and religious conservatives. They came out with things like Focus on the Family, or the religious right movements of the early 80s, the Phyllis Schlafly's and all of those horrible things, came out saying, a woman's proper place is in the home, and these kind of really reified this notion that if a woman is a feminist, she's a bra-burning, man-hating, hairy lesbian, right, that wants to kill men, instead of being like, oh, she's just someone that wants to get paid the same amount as her coworker for the same job, right? It's really pretty simple. If you think that men and women should have the same opportunities and rights, then you're a feminist. That's just how words work, right? Like Aziz Ansari has a great joke about that. Like, that's just how words work, right? If you're like, the people say like, oh, no, I'm not a feminist. Oh, no, I don't like that term, right? But he said it's like if you ask someone, if someone says, oh, I'm a doctor that deals with conditions of the skin, and you're like, oh, so you're a dermatologist. Oh, no, that's too strong a word, right? That kind of thing. It's like, well, that's just how words work. They define things. And if you believe in equal rights for people, then you're a feminist. That's just what that means, right? So these understandings, it makes sense that people have a stigma against it, because people paid millions of dollars to have a public media campaign to transform the public's understanding of these women into these vile, creepy women that want to kill men, because that was easier than actually trying to argue on a platform position of like, why shouldn't women be able to enter the military? Why shouldn't women be able to, compete in these other kind of higher job fields and things of that nature that they were legally excluded from for like a very long period of time, right? So we take a lot of those things for granted nowadays because of the progress that's happened. So I feel like that's why a lot of this Meninism is very, it's flourishing in this time period, in this very Trumpian time period too, because there's a lot of fuel to this misunderstandings and, flawed logic about what the women's rights movement is actually trying to do, right? And so in a lot of ways, that's really affecting the way that we understand it from a political standpoint. And again, these things matter because your political understandings are going to affect your voting. And your voting, if we're letting people put on the agenda what rights you have, those things matter, right? Especially women today take for granted that they have access to birth control and abortion and things like that. That because of current political understandings, that's just not something you can take for granted, right? There's been more restrictions put on Roe v. Wade and access to contraceptives and birth control since 2010 than since 1973. So this is a modern era problem that young feminist women, especially today, don't necessarily realize how tentative these rights are. And you have all these like pop stars and young women being like, well, I wouldn't really call myself a feminist because I don't hate men. And it's like, yeah, well, that's not what that means. So I feel like that's why the stigma remains, is because we have conflated all of these false words with it. And it worked. Their millions of dollars in public media campaign worked, right? In the public imagination. The problem now is that we have to really shift that back. Like you have like Beyonce with the sign saying feminist and things like that. They came after her after that, right? And why not? She's an artist. A lot of artists like to express themselves in ways. So, but this is really, again, a current kind of thing that a lot of people think, oh, that's in the past. We already legislated and figured out these issues of inequality. But they're still ongoing, and it's a political football that goes back and forth as the times change.